I think it was Karpathy the other day said that Rust might be the ideal programming language for LLMs, making the argument that with Rust, if it compiles, it's correct. Hey, welcome, Alex. Thank you for coming on the podcast to talk about the Rust job market. What's your experience of the Rust job market, and how is it at the moment?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question. I guess there's a lot there to unpack. So yeah, the Rust market in general, I think kind of follows the trend of the more general job market, which if you've been around for a while, hasn't been the greatest. So obviously right now there's a lot of hype, I think, in the software development market around all kinds of AI tools and stuff like that. So there's still lots of startups, like kind of new companies coming up and hiring people, but we also see that there's been a lot of layoffs and hiring freezes in let's say the larger corporations, the larger companies. So I think it's kind of like a mixed bag for Rust. It is kind of a newer language. It is a language that's kind of in vogue. Many startups and new companies, new projects are adopting Rust. So on the one hand, I think the software engineering job market is not the greatest. But on the other hand, the Rust market is actually, doing much better than some other markets. So we see a lot of adoption. There's a lot of momentum behind the Rust community. Loads of interesting projects, kind of being developed. Also in the open source space that are using Rust. So I would say it's a great time for the Rust community in terms of jobs. Even though, on a whole, it's not the best software engineering job market that we've seen in recent years. So, depending on your experience, if you're like more experienced, less experienced, if you have a lot of experience, specifically with Rust, we can have different experiences in terms of how easy it is to get a job.
Within the market, are there any skills that are particularly in demand? Like, is it particularly useful having, say, Tokio experience or any other framework that's really stands out as something that would be very, very beneficial to have in your CV as a Rust developer?
Yeah, so I guess it really depends on the industry that you're kind of targeting. So, like interestingly, I think Rust adoption is pretty widespread. So we kind of see it being used, let's say, for embedded systems. We see it being used for database development, data systems, data processing. More general, like backend systems. You see it a lot in the cryptocurrency blockchain space as well. So I would say specific industry experience is usually more important than having some kind of experience with a specific tool. I have worked in some other programming language niches as well, which are far more I would say fragmented than the Rust space. So I don't see like specific tool that kind of is more important than others. I would say your more general, your background, your industry background, your seniority is more important than a specific tool in the Rust community. Yeah.
So pulling at that thread a little bit then, are there any particular domains where having that market knowledge and Rust is particularly beneficial then?
Yeah, so right now, for example, in the database development space, we see a lot of new startups, kind of starting out rewriting maybe some traditional systems in Rust, writing new databases from scratch, rewriting like in data formats, stuff like that, for the modern era, let's say, in Rust. So we do see like a lot of demand for Rust in these spaces. So think of tools like Polars, which is kind of like a Pandas replacement, data frame library, but also like database companies, like for example, Melee Search, which is kind of like an Elasticsearch replacement, or ParadeDB, which basically gives you full text search on Postgres. These are kind of these new startups which are building these new cool database technologies, and many of them are using Rust for this. And there are a bunch of open source technologies in this space, which I think kind of are kind of leading. So think of Apache Arrow, Apache Data Fusion are very popular. Open source libraries to kind of build these query engine and database frameworks. Another one in the full text search space is Tantivy, also a pretty popular kind of Lucene replacement library, which I see being used quite extensively in the space. And there's a bunch of others that I'm probably also forgetting, but yeah, there's a lot of movements, a lot of momentum in the kind of in the data infrastructure database space in Rust, which is quite interesting. Like personally, I come from more JVM background. I don't know if you remember like the whole Hadoop MapReduce kind of era, Apache Spark, all those that whole like ecosystem seems to kind of migrating, at least the newer tools in this ecosystem seem to kind of be migrating towards the Apache Arrow Data Fusion ecosystem, and many of these new databases, new tools are using Rust at their core.
Yeah, I get the impression that's driven by the fact that machine learning AI is so top of mind at the moment, and a lot of people in that space work in Python, but they want that fast underlying library. So there's that push to a faster version of Pandas. We get Polars, a fast version of this data format or this data platform. So bits of it or all of it is being rewritten in Rust to kind of get that performance, so that we get machine learning researchers are happy with Python, but we get the performance to deploy it and use it because we build the infrastructure in Rust.
Yeah, I think definitely like performance is a big part of it, but I think also like the user, like the developer experience is also a big part of it. Like back in the day, you had to provision all these custom clusters, Hadoop, EMR, the deployment complexity and using these tools in production was very, very complicated. Whereas I see these new technologies using Rust, a single binary that you can kind of deploy and pretty much use everywhere. WebAssembly, this kind of technology also makes it much easier to run these things in production. Operations are simpler, but also like the experience of working with these things is just much nicer. And I think the Rust ecosystem is a big part of that. It's not been one of the favorite programming language according to many of these surveys for many years. There's a reason why these developers are kind of adopting Rust for this. I think that's also a big part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that note, somebody, I think it was Karpathy the other day, said that Rust might be the ideal programming language for LLMs, making the argument that with Rust, if it compiles, it's correct. I think that's a bit wishful thinking and not true, but I think the sentiment there is that the compiler and the error checking it does really force you to have got very, very close to it being correct if it compiles. You can still obviously introduce logical errors and errors in the rules and the business system that you're building, should we say. But if it compiles, it's probably going to do something, even if it's not quite the business logic you wanted.
For sure. No, it definitely like eliminates a whole class of errors. Gives you memory safety. It constrains you to write code in a very specific way, which eliminates all these kinds of runtime errors that you may have with some other languages, right? So having like a strongly typed language, a compiler, that helps you with that, I think that's definitely helpful. And also, using these AI tools, these LLMs, these agents, I think the feedback loop is also much nicer when you actually have like a compiled language, which basically gives you feedback pretty quickly. You can also use that feedback in your developer process. You can kind of feed that back into the LLM, and this can kind of help you develop. I think that's a pretty nice way of working. And you get this feedback like pretty early, rather than having to run something, you see it doesn't work, and then you have to instruct your coding agent or whatever to write it or to to basically tell it that something is wrong, right? So I think that's that's kind of a nice approach. I think maybe it's not for everyone, but it does give you like feedback loop where you fail kind of early, and you can kind of fix your problems early on rather than finding out later, where it becomes very difficult to kind of debug these things. So I think definitely it's a nice tool. The question is like, will all these tools evolve to a point where, these programming languages kind of become obsolete and we get to model our problems, even at a higher level? But I think for now, definitely like compiled languages with, strong type systems and, things like we have in Rust, the ownership model and stuff like that, definitely, I think, help with that.
Yeah, I don't think we're going to see getting rid of programming languages anytime soon. After all, LLMs are predicting the next text, so they've got to predict some text. We don't have the training data for them to predict straight to machine code, and machine code isn't as portable as, say, Rust or Go would be. So, Go is a very simple language for you to get it to predict. Rust is very, as you say, lots of great feedback loops. If it compiles, you've got a lot of feedback. If it doesn't compile, you've got that feedback very, very early. So I think they're great languages. Trying to go lower level and replace them, I think, will be a huge challenge for an LLM because it doesn't really fit with its architecture.
No, I agree. I mean, definitely, like, there's a reason why we have been using programming languages the way we have for, at least 50, 60 years. So, I guess it's at least likely that for the next 50, 60 years, we'll still be using like similar programming languages, at least at this level of abstraction. And then, maybe in the future, like it's hard to predict. I think it's very hard to predict like second order effects of these LLM tools. Like first order effects, I think we can pretty much understand, you can use this thing, you see what kind of benefits it brings. But on a longer term, how will this evolve? That's a big question. Like, I have no clue. Like, how will this affect the job market, for example? I think this is also something which is extremely difficult to predict. On the one hand, it becomes super easy, almost frictionless to write code. But on the other hand, all this increase in entropy, like how are you going to deal with this? Because if it's so easy to add all these features, like the combination of all these features and their interactions, creates even more complexity. So in the long term, what are actually the effects of these things? I think it's we're living in very interesting times. I think it will be interesting to see.
Yeah. So you're running a couple of job boards at the moment, one for Rust and one for Scala. Do you see any change in the adverts that you get? Are you seeing more people asking for AI or more people asking people not to use AI in their applications? Is any of this being reflected in the job ads that you're getting?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I definitely think the way companies interview people has kind of evolved. Just because these tools have kind of changed, how developers work. And I think we're actually in a very interesting time right now because it seems like it's quite recent where these tools have actually become like pretty good at actually coding and almost like one-shotting, relatively good, solutions to do the problems that you kind of give them. So yeah, I think, it's interesting times because it's easier to cheat, for example, and it's not just about coding because it's also much easier to to create fake CVs, fake profiles, to tailor CVs very specifically to specific jobs. So yeah, I actually spend quite a lot of time now actually filtering out like fake applicants. It's usually pretty easy to kind of find them, but yeah, it's just a bit of a burden. It's a kind of a waste of time to have to do this, and I've seen this change quite a lot over time. In terms of like asking for LLM coding skills, I haven't seen this like specifically. I think it's kind of like implicit, pretty much that many people use them, and I think they're also relatively natural to use. So I haven't really seen any shift specifically in that. But yeah, in the interview process, we've had people ask us like, what is the right way going forward, like interviewing people? Because how do we actually assess people's skills? Because if you just have like a take-home assignment you can do in your free time, how sure are you that the person who implemented this actually understood this deeply, rather than just kind of outsource this to an LLM? I mean, usually these assignments are relatively easy tasks, kind of constrained, kind of small kind of constrained kind of tasks, so relatively easy for LLMs to solve. So yeah, definitely that's a big part of it. Like, how do you kind of adapt to this in your interview process? And I think many companies, they they kind of accept the fact that people use these tools. So it's okay to use them. But then how do you assess people's skills? Like I think this changes slightly. So yeah, I think like system design, more social skills type interviews are becoming more popular, but also on-site interviews definitely becoming more important as well. Actually seeing people in person and seeing how they interact with these tools. Um, so yeah, that's something that I'm seeing. And in terms of yeah, jobs on the on the job posting, the job market, the job board. Yeah, haven't seen too much like evolution over time. Like I think there used to be a lot of cryptocurrency jobs. I think that's a little bit you know there are a bit fewer of those nowadays. But still, like I think there's a pretty wide range of companies that are kind of using Rust, so it's pretty diverse. I would say there's pretty much like a bit of everything from embedded to backend to data to some crypto stuff as well.
All right, cool. So on the interviewing, it seems to me that we need to have more and more focus on behavioral interviews and competency-based interviews, where you set that homework assignment, but then you are prepared to follow up and ask them questions and dig into how they understand their solution. I think one of the problems we've had there is we haven't historically taught engineering managers and hiring managers how to conduct those interviews. So some big tech organizations do it very well and they give people training, but the majority of the industry just says, hey, you're interviewing someone, go do it. And they give you no training, no preparation. They don't have any consistent way of doing it. They don't have a rubric to grade people. So it's very, very hit and miss.
Yeah.
I think that's something we need to fix with more training, more focus on behavioral and competency-based interviews. And that will allow people to work around AI and fit in with whether you allow it or you don't allow it. You also mentioned that when you're assessing applications, there are some tells and it's easy to pick out when someone's used AI. So what are the things that you're looking for there?
Yeah, usually it's like hyper specialized, hyper tailored to specific, job posting. So there are specific requirements, and then you can see like a developer, they're basically tailoring their profile very specifically to this job, and usually like we don't interact with people once, but people apply to multiple jobs or we talk to them multiple times. So if we see that they're kind of overfitting their CV for a specific job, usually kind of it's not necessarily like a negative thing, but if it's like too overt and maybe too specific, it kind of like maybe you get a few question marks about how honest this really is. So I think it's okay to kind of tailor your CV specifically for job, but I think if it's like too much, if it feels too overfitted, let's say, I think that can be that can scare people off. But also like fake applicants, like completely fake applicants, are also like pretty common. So usually like it's pretty easy to spot them. Because usually they just have a very recent like LinkedIn profile that's just created like a few months ago, and then it gets deleted because it's fake. So they kind of need to keep creating and churning out these fake profiles. And also I think sometimes they're like imposters. So people pretend that they're someone else that they're not. So yeah, I mean, it's definitely something that's becoming more common because these tools do help people create these CVs very, very easily.
So why do you think people are doing that?
It's a good question. I think yeah, apparently there are some like scammers out there in this space, which is quite unfortunate. But yeah, I think it's a pretty far-fetched kind of scam. I don't know like exactly how this works because yeah, usually we get to like find out pretty soon that it's like a fake profile. But yeah, it seems to be like a scam out there. Like I've heard of some North Korean kind of companies trying to infiltrate some US companies, etc., etc. But yeah, I don't know all the details to be honest. Like this is kind of mostly hearsay. But I do see this phenomenon. Like this is like 100%, 100% clear.
Yep. I do know of one US company where I have some colleagues and they have interviewed somebody that they suspect was from a sanctioned country trying to earn money outside of that country. So yeah, it's definitely happening. So it's a strange world
Yeah,
we
and I
live
think
in,
there
isn't
may be
it?
some there may be like some scams where people like get paid or like get an onboarding bonus or like a hiring bonus or whatever, and then kind of disappear. Like I've heard of this as well. Yeah, I mean, I don't know how high the success rate with this. Like it seems to me that this would be like pretty low because it's relatively easy to kind of find out relatively early. But yeah, I mean, they must be doing it for a reason. So yeah, I'm not sure.
Interesting. Spinning it round the other side then, if you're a hiring manager trying to hire for Lust, what are some of the challenges you're going to face? And is there anything you can do to make it easier to find good Lust developers?
Yeah, so I think it's a very pretty tight, pretty niche market. So it is easy, relatively easy right now in this market to just say, I want people with X years of Rust experience, and they need to have worked in this and this, this and that industry. So you can be very specific. You can constrain yourself very specifically to these kind of very specific experience, let's say. So that works relatively well in this market, just because I think the supply of developers versus demand for developers is kind of skewed towards high supply. So there's quite a lot of people on the market right now that are looking for jobs versus relatively low demand compared to, let's say, a few years ago. So right now, like I think from my experience, most companies, they can be pretty pretty picky and pretty strict in this regard. Which on the one hand, yeah, I mean, it's nice if you're a senior developer and you have very extensive experience with specific technologies that are in demand. On the other hand, it's also, I think, frustrating for people who, maybe don't have as much experience or kind of trying to, enter a new kind of market or trying to develop a new type of skill set. So, it can be pretty tricky, I think, to get into the space if you don't have any experience with it yet. But from a company perspective, I think it's relatively easy now to find talent if you if you know what you want, and sometimes also you need to be a little bit pragmatic because I do see like some companies hiring on site with very specific requirements, and that can still be tricky because there's still plenty of like remote positions out there, and I think most developers definitely prefer remote positions, and also like you're not bound to your geographical area. You can pretty much hire in a much broader you got to pick from a much broader pool. So there are times where companies kind of constrain themselves a bit too much, to the point where it's not super realistic to be able to reach a lot of developers. In other cases it's relatively easy for them. So yeah, it really depends. Like companies have like extremely different, like very, very different, like the variance in terms of requirements is very large. Like for going from on-site, having very specific knowledge. So it really, really depends. It's kind of hard to give very like general like advice on that. But yeah, in many cases, I would say try to be realistic. Try to understand requirements are realistic, how many developers there actually are out there, with these kinds of skills, like within, your geographical kind of hiring bounds. And then, ask yourself, is this really what I'm looking for? Do I really need people to be on site all the time, or can we also do this remotely? That's actually the main thing. I think going from on site to remote is what makes it, like significantly easier to reach significantly more people. On the other hand, sometimes you do really want to have people on site because it's very important for for your mission or the way you work. And then maybe you need to be a bit more pragmatic, and maybe relax some other constraints a little bit more. Like are you really going to find a lot of Rust developers very specifically in your town? And I don't know where. That's usually not very likely.
Yes, unless you're in London or another major city, finding that concentration of people.
Exactly. Like I think if
is
you're in
unlikely.
London or New York, it's pretty likely you can also attract people to move there. But in other cases, it's much more tricky. So yeah.
And the thing is, if you're in London and New York, there's also more people competing for that talent.
Exactly. And also it's the cost is also like a big factor. Hiring in specific places can be much more expensive.
So it sounds very much it sounds very much like the Rust market suffers from the same sort of problems as many other markets, in that everybody wants to hire senior developers who are experienced, already have several years experience in Rust. So are there any things that somebody trying to break into the Rust market can do to increase their chances of getting a job as a Rust developer? Say if they're transitioning from C or C++ or something else to, what can they do to increase their chances?
So the way the market is right now, I think you're right. Definitely, like most companies, they do, if they're hiring Rust engineers, they want people with at least a few years of professional Rust experience. That's usually what I see. So it is indeed pretty tricky right now to kind of get into this market. People indeed, they often ask me like, what can I do to get into this market? So I think there's a few different things that you can do. So first of all, I think the highest signal thing that you can do, which also shows high agency, is start using Rust in your current job. It can be, you can start small, you can start on a very specific, isolated thing. There must be like some tool or something small, some small automation or whatever that you can start writing, right? I think that's usually like the highest kind of signal, high signal kind of thing that you can do is, start adopting it if you really think, there's a good use case for it, start adopting it internally in your own company. Unfortunately, some companies are very, very conservative. They really don't want to pick up or kind of adopt newer technologies. So, if that's really not possible, then, the second best thing I would say is to, maybe contribute to some open source projects. I would advise against building like a small toy project. For educational reasons, it's great, of course, to kind of build something and try it out, etc. But if you're doing it to find a job, I think it's more valuable if you contribute to an existing project. There are many projects out there, where you can start out with a pretty small contribution, where people are super friendly or kind of helpful and want to help you out. Maybe there's some low-hanging fruit, some simple tasks you can kind of pick up and get up to speed. The nicest thing about doing open source contribution is that it's actually out there in the open. It's in public. People can actually see the substance of your work. It shows them that you're passionate about this. You're kind of dedicating your free time to this. So there's also, I think, lots of signal there. That you're a dedicated person, high agency in terms of picking up something new. So I think those are the two main things. Where you can kind of make a difference and kind of, show that you're ambitious, that you're actually, driven and, actually, you like to, do something and show that you have, specific skills in this technology. But I would also say, like, if you are not super experienced and maybe looking for your first job, I would say don't limit yourself, to Rust. Like Rust is a great language, it's a great tool, it's a great community. But there's also other things in software engineering which are at least as important to learn and to important skills to develop, technical and non-technical. So I wouldn't limit myself necessarily just to Rust if you're looking for your first job. Try to be open and if you're passionate about Rust, you can always kind of move into it later. I think it's easier to kind of move into Rust once you're a little bit more experienced rather than when you're kind of starting out. Because like junior Rust positions, like I've seen like very, very few of them. Like I've seen a few internships here and there, maybe a few junior positions, but I think they are like exceedingly rare, especially compared to some other.
That makes sense. I mean, it's a great tip on the open source. I know several Rust developers who have been hired because of their open source contributions. So people looking for developers went, we use this open source project. Who's a big contributor? Who's contributed recently? Who's active? Who might be looking? So they've targeted those projects that they use to go and find people with an interest and a focus on what they're doing. So that's been a good loop for that kind of inbound marketing, if you will, that we can get as a software engineer.
Yeah, no, definitely. And in some cases, like we work with our customers on a recruitment basis. So we don't only have like job postings, but we also like partner with companies and kind of assist them through the whole hiring process. And definitely like GitHub open source is definitely also like a source we look at. It's a very high signal in terms of what have you worked on. We can actually see what kind of project you've worked on. So if you're, for example, Apache Arrow or Data Fusion contributor, would likely also be a good match for a company that's using this technology to build their database internals or data processing frameworks. So that's definitely something we look at, and it's very high signal as well.
What about LinkedIn then? Do you leverage that when you're looking for people for your clients?
Yeah, definitely. Definitely LinkedIn is very valuable. It is usually like a combination of these things. So we kind of have a pretty strong network ourselves.
So if anybody wants to be found as a Rust developer, what are the kind of things they should do to their LinkedIn profile to make sure that you can easily find them?
Yeah, so to be easily found, basically you need to add the relevant keywords because if you don't have them on there, it's pretty difficult to find people. Like I have a team of recruiters that work with me, and sometimes we can kind of find adjacent technologies, adjacent keywords to kind of unearth people, to kind of find people who potentially also are interested in Rust. But if you don't have these keywords on your profile, like if your profile is not up to date, if you don't have the most recent experiences on there, it usually is harder, for recruiters to find you. So if you want to, kind of make sure that people can find you based on, these specific technologies that maybe you want to continue working in, then definitely, add these to your profile, update it. Usually, we can tell a lot from how people their CV.
Is there anywhere in the LinkedIn profile they should really focus? So do you want to put Rust developer as your job title? Is it in your about section? Is it in the description of the job? Where's kind of the highest value points to break it?
Yeah, I think it doesn't
keywords
matter.
are working.
Yeah, I mean, you can pretty much put it anywhere. I think like you don't necessarily need to put it in your in your headline or in your title. Maybe that's a bit overkill even. I think you can just put it in your job descriptions, like in your experience descriptions. I think you can list the technologies that you've worked with for each of your positions. You can also add like skills. So you can add Rust as a skill on your profile. So, if you have a combination of those, usually I think that gives a recruiter a pretty good understanding of, how long you've worked with Rust because you list it in a specific, work experience, and also like on your profile in general. So, I mean, that at least means that you're interested in Rust, which can usually also be a signal. But I think the most useful thing is just to actually list it in each specific work experience. That way, a recruiter actually knows how many years or how long you've actually worked with this profile. I think that's the most descriptive and the most complete way of putting it in there, basically.
Awesome. Hey, guys. Any final advice then you'd really advise me to focus on if they're trying to find a Rust job and break into this market?
Yeah, so I mean, I would say, I think if you're really like passionate about Rust and you want to work with this language, keep going. Like I think I see a lot of people who kind of give up. They don't get a Rust job right away. The market is not the easiest. It's not the best like software engineer market that there has been. So I would say, if you're really passionate about this language, and if you really want to work with it, keep trying, keep going. Build some personal projects, contribute to open source. I think try to adopt it in your current project at work. By doing things with this language, I think it's really the best way to kind of learn, by using it in practice, by using it professionally, by using it in open source. It's a great way to learn. It's a great way to to use it. But it's also strong signal for companies that you really care about this language, that you have the skills in this language. They can actually see your open source contributions. So there's actually substance to your work, to the way they analyze your profile. So I would say those are the things that I would focus on, and don't give up. Maybe you don't find a job right away, but if you're really passionate about it and keep going, at some point I think it's definitely possible to land a job with with Rust. So just keep going and be positive and do stuff, build stuff. I think that's really the main thing. Try to be high agency and don't you don't think, it's not magic, right? Rust job is not gonna kind of magically appear. Like you need to work for it, and it's a language with a high, with a steep learning curve. It can be difficult to learn, to master. But I think once you've actually landed the Rust job, I think it's usually it means that's usually an interesting industry, an interesting job, and usually also a high-paying job. Usually also in companies where you can kind of learn a lot, and there's lots of other passionate people craft. So it usually means you're kind of enter an interesting environment where you can kind of keep growing and learn a lot. So I think it's definitely worth it, but it does require effort and kind of consistency, basically.
Awesome, thank you, Alex. So where should people go to find the best Rust job board?
Well, I would say, rustjobs.dev. There's a reason why, if you search for Rust jobs on Google, like we're at the top. But also, if you want any advice or anything else, either as a company who's looking for Rust developers or a Rust developer who kind of wants maybe some advice on their career or advice on their CV or on their LinkedIn profile, feel free to reach out. We do get a lot of applicants to our job board, so unfortunately I can't respond to everyone. But if you ping me personally, I always try my best to help and see if I can contribute, to your future in the Rust space. So feel free to reach out, drop me a message. I'm always happy to to help out, basically.
Is the best way to do that through Rust jobs, or is it through LinkedIn?
LinkedIn, Rust jobs, wherever. I'm pretty active everywhere. Okay. I try to be responsive.
Cool. We'll put your LinkedIn profile then and rustjobs.dev links in the show notes for everyone. Thank you very much, Alex. It's been a pleasure.
Sounds great. It was great being on the show.
Thank you. I hope you enjoyed that episode of Coding Chats. If you did, please like and subscribe. And feel free to check out these other videos on a similar topic.